There's something sinister on your street. It's a bad neighbor. But what if you've become what you've been trying to avoid? Bad neighbors.
That thing at the end gets me every time. Good morning. Good to see you guys. Glad you're here in church this morning, whether you're in person or online with us. And if I haven't met you, my name is Adam, and I'm the campus pastor here. And thank you for that. I didn't even pay him. That's amazing. But we are in week 2 of this series called Bad Neighbors. We're talking about how do we avoid becoming a bad neighbor, because neighboring seemed to be really, really important to Jesus in terms of what he thought was our mission here on earth, what we're to do, how to have a full life. And in fact, last week, if you were here, I challenged you to take away this little diagram here. And if this week you weren't here last week, you can grab one of these. It should be on your chair and fill it out. The red square in here represents you. That's why we printed you there, just so you guys know. And all the ones around are your neighbors. And I challenged you last week to see if you could answer A, B, and C for this. Like the first one, A, was just like the names of your neighbors, because most people do not know their neighbors' names. And as we said last week, it's hard to really love someone that you've never even really noticed, that you've never even bothered to get to know their name. And so we sent that home with you. And I wanted to give you a little bit of an update. I've been working through my neighbor diagram as well. And I didn't make it all the way through this week. I'll just be honest with you guys. I was able to talk to one neighbor that I hadn't met before, and there was a couple that I already knew their names and have already met them. They've already been to our house, but I've still got some work to do on this. How many of you still got a little bit of work to do on your neighboring grid? How many of you didn't even think about it until just now? Okay, yeah, a few of you. And so just take that next reminder of the new one, and you can start all over this week. But I want us to really focus in on trying to get to know our neighbors this week. I think it's essential to being Christ followers in our modern age. And I want to encourage you to take some notes today. Write down some things that jump out at you, some things you want to think about or latch onto or have a discussion about what this means. And if you are taking notes, the title of my message today is Crickets and Clocks. Crickets and Clocks. Remember that old movie Pinocchio? The original one. You guys know what I'm talking about? The original Disney Pinocchio. It's supposed to be a kid's movie. It's pretty dark. I don't know how long it's been since you've seen it. It's rough. I mean, there's a lot of stuff going on in there. It's like this little puppet gets carved out of wood, and then he ends up getting captured by Stromboli, who's like an evil puppeteer. But it just sounds like a delicious treat to me, Stromboli. And the puppeteer is so mean. He yells at him. He like hits him. He locks him in a cage. And then he finally escapes. And then he runs away. And he goes to Pleasure Island, right, with all the little boys who are chain smoking cigars and drinking a lot of beer. And then they're vandalizing things and cursing. And then like they start fires and start burning things down, right? Even as a kid, I was like, should we be watching this? Is this okay? Like, this is rough. And the only thing rougher than the movie of it is the ride. Have you guys been on the ride at Disneyland? That will freak you out. It's worse than any horror film, right? One time when we first moved here, we went on that ride, and we were riding through the Pinocchio ride, and it got stuck. We got stuck in hell on the Pinocchio ride, and I will never go back to Disneyland. It ruined it for me. It just freaked me out, right? It's a weird, wild thing, but the gist of the movie, in case you can't remember, or it's been too long, or you never knew, is that, the puppet, he wants to be a real boy. And so to help him fully become human, he's followed around by this like physical representation of his conscience to sort of remind him on an ongoing basis to reconsider how he's living, like whether or not he's living right. And his happens to be represented by a little cricket in a tuxedo named Jiminy Cricket, which some of you may remember. He's adorable, right? But I got to tell you, if you have kids, you know what it's like to have a physical representation of your conscience following you around, forcing you to reflect on whether or not you're living right? Because your kids will call you out. I remember always wanting, I couldn't wait until our kids could talk, and then once they could talk and start critiquing me, I was like, how do we shut them up? You know what I mean? Because they will play that role in your life, and they're not trying to shame you. I just think in the mind of a child, especially when they're very young and very innocent, they genuinely don't understand why the things that you do don't always match the things that you say that you value, or the things that you tell them that they ought to value. I can't count the number of times as a young parent when I was driving around with my kids and they're all little and they would see something that they thought needed to be remedied, and they were just like, you need to do something about this right now, Dad, or you don't care about people, right? Which feels heavy, right? And they would be pointing to a homeless person who was, begging for food, or maybe a stray dog just running wild in the neighborhood, or somebody who broke down by the side of the road. And, in those moments, I would calmly explain to them why it was unrealistic for me to stop and help, right? I'm just like, we're already late. And if I give this guy the lunch that I've packed, I'm not going to be able to eat lunch today, And that's when my youngest was like, but you're chubby, you don't need it. And I was like, okay, you know what? We don't need to get personal. Okay, I'm still going to be hungry, and that's the point that I'm trying to make. If I go, it's going to take forever to try and capture this dog and then take him to wherever you take dogs that you catch, and then he's going to get the car all dirty and your mom's going to get mad. If I pull over and help this person change their pop tire, I'm going to get my clothes all messy, then I'm going to have to go to my work meeting with just disheveled, and that's not going to work. And as I'm saying all these things, just really explaining to them that I'd love to, but I can't. I just can't. To me, everything I'm saying is a reasonable justification, but to my kids, they just sound like ridiculous excuses. And I think at moments like these, it's easy for us to look at kids and think man, kids they don't get it. You know what I mean? The adult world is just too complicated for them to understand all the nuances of what's going on. And it is. But I wonder do we sometimes do this thing where we tell ourselves that a situation is more complicated than it really is, to avoid having to do anything really uncomfortable. And if you were the only one that sort of noticed this about your life, the discrepancy sometimes between what you really want to care about and how you actually live your everyday life, you could probably, ignore it. But that little voice has this way of sort of calling out your callousness, your excuses, your hypocrisy. In a way, if you are a parent, it's like you're Pinocchio, right? And your kids are that little tuxedoed cricket. And as annoying as it is, sometimes it's actually helpful, right? Because we do all need occasional real-time reminders to just be better humans. And God, I think, is gracious enough to give us those things. And he does it in a lot of different ways. I wonder if you have ever unexpectedly been alerted that you have lost touch with what you pretend is most important. And I say pretend because what is actually important to you isn't what you say it is. It's what you show that it is. And there are moments in which something happens which sort of alerts us to the disconnection between the two in our own lives. And maybe from you, it was something that a kid asked, or a sentence that you saw in a blog, or a surprising moment in a movie that got you emotional and thinking about your life. Or maybe it was a pop song that was on shuffle in a grocery store, and people are like, why are you crying in front of the mac and cheese? And you're like, I just thought of something. I don't know who I am anymore. And people are like, you got weird, man. The truth is, God is not above using anything to get your attention. In fact, ancient Christian mystics used to say that God is everything whispering, and that everything is God whispering. That, God, in other words, is not above using anything to try and get your attention. The question is, are you paying enough attention to hear what it's saying to you? And that's sort of where we come to when we approach the verses that this whole series is built around. Parables are really these creative short stories designed to help you see yourself and your life and your world from a fresh perspective. And Jesus used them more than anything to sort of teach what he saw as the point of living. And he seemed to hope that they would function kind of like this cricket on your shoulder, or like a kid in the back of your car, constantly pushing you to face the self-centered parts of yourself that you had successfully been able to ignore until now. And so in this series, we're looking at all 4 weeks, this story that Jesus tells, this parable of the Good Samaritan. And last week, we said that it is difficult to love a neighbor that you've never bothered to notice. And the question I want to begin to wrestle with this week is like, yeah, that's true, but like, why don't we notice? Like, why isn't it that we don't take time to stop and engage with our neighbors, to notice them, to pay attention to them, to get to know them in a real way? Why is this? Because I don't actually think that most of you are just these hard-hearted, calloused people that don't care about anybody else. I mean, some of you are. Statistically, that's got to be true, right? But I think for most of us, right, we really do want to care. We don't want to sort of breeze by and not notice the people that God has put in front of us, but we do. Why? And that's what I want us to wrestle with this week as we approach this story yet again. It's found in Luke chapter 10. We're going to start in verse 30 this week. And Jesus is talking, and he's telling a story, and he says this: a Jewish man was traveling and attacked by bandits. They stripped him, beat him, and left him for dead. A priest came along, but when he saw the man lying there, he crossed to the other side and passed him by. Later, a temple assistant walked over and looked at him, but passed by on the other side as well. Then a despised Samaritan came along, and when he saw the man, he felt compassion for him. Going over to him, he soothed his wounds with oil and wine and bandaged them. Then he put the man on his own donkey and took him to an inn where he took care of him. The next day, he handed the innkeeper 2 silver coins, which is more than it sounds like, guys. Not quarters, just so you know. Saying, take care of this man. As his bill runs higher, I'll pay it the next time I'm here. So the first 2 people walk by, which is easy to see on the surface, the priest and the temple assistant. And the question I have is why? Why do they walk by and do nothing? And there's probably a lot of reasons, but I think the biggest one, the biggest reason they don't stop, they don't pause, they don't help, they don't do anything is the same big reason we don't. And it's one simple word: time. Time. They just felt like they didn't have enough time. They were too busy. They had stuff going on. And I think first and foremost, the reason why I believe this about this story is that you have 2 Jewish religious workers who are naturally going to be concerned with Jewish purity laws, right? There are all sorts of laws wrapped around what you have to do to be what's called ceremonially clean in the Jewish faith. And I'll just read you a few of these because they're fun. This is the Old Testament, Numbers chapter 19, verse 11. You're going to be so thankful as I start reading that we don't have to do this stuff anymore. Verse 11 says this: all those who touch a dead human body will be ceremonially unclean for 7 days. Some of you are like, that's my favorite hobby. That takes so much out of the mix. And if you're thinking that, please scoot away from that person. There's something weird with them. They must purify themselves on the 3rd and 7th day with holy water. If they don't, they will continue to be unclean, and they will be cut off from their community by touching a dead body. Furthermore, when someone dies in a tent, very specific, all those who enter that tent will be unclean for 7 days. Any container in the tent with no lid is also defiled. This is the scriptural insistence on Tupperware, guys. It's in the Bible. If someone in an open field touches the corpse of someone who was killed with the sword or died of natural causes, why those 2 examples, I don't know. Or if someone touches a human bone or a grave, they will be defiled for 7 days as well. Now, there are lots of questions that these laws bring up that I cannot answer for you today. Like what if they didn't die by a sword or natural causes? What if it was nunchucks, right? We're not going to answer that today. Can you touch a corpse then? I don't know. I can't answer that. I'm not an ancient rabbi. But the point of this related to our story is, if these two guys, the first two people in the story that pass by, if they are to touch this man who's been beaten and left for dead, if he actually is dead, they're going to be contaminated. And if they're contaminated according to the laws in which they strictly live by, especially as temple workers, it's going to mean that they are going to have to not be able to do their job, spend time with their family, or help anybody else in need for a minimum of 7 days. That's a lot of time to lose. Also, if he's already dead, you can't help him anyway. So it's better just to assume he's dead and walk on by. If he is alive, that's also going to take a ton of time too. I mean, look at everything that the guy who actually stopped the Samaritan does for him. He bandages his wounds. He pours oil and wine on his cuts. He puts the man on his own donkey. He travels on foot to an inn miles away. He checks him in. He takes care of him. He arranges for lasting care. He pays for it. He promises to return later and help. And that's just the stuff that Jesus lists here. He might have done even more. Like, you ever look at this list and just think, how long did that take? 2 days? 10 days? How long does that list take to execute? I'll tell you this, the Samaritan's life was completely pulled off task and off target by taking care of this other person. It was a huge investment. It cost him money and business and connections and resources and personal space and most definitely time. And then there were all the relational consequences, right? He didn't have a cell phone. There's no way for him to let anybody who's expecting him know that he is not going to be continuing on and arrive at the place where he was supposed to be. At minimum, his wife is going to be very angry. Can you imagine just showing him and be like, babe, I'm so sorry. I'm 6 days late for dinner. There was a guy, and she's like, I'm going to stop you right there. I put all your stuff on the back porch. Shh. At least bring me a necklace, something. And this, I think, is often how it works. The decision to help someone else doesn't just inconvenience you, it inconveniences everything and everyone you're connected to. And this is why we don't want to do it. This is why we're like, it's not worth it. I can't stop. I don't have the time. Because we realize that there is a ripple effect to pausing our life to get into somebody else's. But to Jesus, when he tells this story, all of the people who know him really well know that it's not just a story to him. This is the way that he lived. There are so many examples in the New Testament where Jesus is on his way somewhere and then he stops along the way to help somebody, which is wild because he only has 3 years to complete his mission, to save the world. It's a big mission. And yet he was extraordinarily interruptible. In fact, if you go through and look at the miracles that Jesus performed in the New Testament, almost every healing Jesus performed happened after he was interrupted on his way somewhere else. And that makes me wonder, like, what sort of healing does God want to bring into somebody else's life by interrupting you? And by not stopping, by not waiting, by not paying attention, what is it really costing them? Maybe you hear the fact that Jesus stopped a lot and you're like, well, good for Jesus. I don't have the power of healing shooting out of my fingers, okay? And also, it's not that I just don't have time for my neighbors, right? I don't have time for anything. I'm not a jerk. I'm just busy. You ever said this, at least to yourself in your own heart? I'm not a jerk. I'm just busy. And I can imagine the priest and the temple assistant saying the same exact thing to themselves as they walked on by. And yet I bet they also followed it up with the same thing that we tell ourselves when we don't want to get involved with something. We're just like, you know what? I can't right now. I don't have the time, but later I will. But here's the thing about later. It never gets here. I bet you've got a whole list of things that you've been telling yourself for years that you're going to do later, and you've just never gotten to it. But that's okay, because there's always later. And the reason we keep telling ourselves this is because we get really good at believing 3 very potent lies. And the first one I think we tell ourselves is that this is just a busy season. How many of you told yourself that recently, right? You know what? It's just a busy season, right? But here's the reality. Seasons end, okay? How long has it been? If it's been 42 years, it ain't a season. Okay, this is your lifestyle. And here's the thing about this too. Does life really get less busy as it goes on? Every season I leave behind, right? I look back and think like, wow, I really thought I was busy then, but I didn't even know what busy was. Man, I really wish I would have been more intentional investing my time on things that matter more. Remember how busy you thought you were in high school? And you look back and you're like, shameful. I had no idea how hard it was going to get. And yet the truth is, I think life gets more complex over time, not less, which means if you haven't begun initiating the steps to become the kind of person God is calling you to be, it's never going to get easier. I think the second lie that we tell ourselves and believe is that it's only going to be like this until I hit this one goal. It's only going to be like this until I hit this one. I just need to keep my head down for a while. It says just until I make the money, get the promotion, get the house the way I need it. And then after that, I'm going to be able to focus on other people and how they're doing and how they're feeling and what they need from me. But here's the reality of this. Behind every completed goal is just another goal. Have you noticed that? You're like, man, when I get there, things are going to change. And then you're like, oh, I didn't realize there's a bunch of things after that. And then and then the next thing. And then it begins to roll. And that's how your season gets to be 42 years long. It becomes who you are. And the third lie I think we tell ourselves is that everybody lives at this crazy pace. Look around. Everybody lives at this crazy pace. And you know the reality? Their lives suck. Okay, I just want to be honest with you guys this morning. They're not enjoying it. Some people actually do, right? They prefer and they can actually handle a faster pace, okay? I married one of those people. But, others of us are not built like that. Like some of us, we can handle a lot more initiatives at once. Some people need more downtime to recover than other people. But here's the thing. It doesn't really matter what somebody else does or somebody else is doing. What matters is taking time for what you value most. When your life is over, you are going to have to give an explanation for why you did what you did, not why they did what they did. And some of us, we think that's how it's going to work. Well, I just had to do because they were. And it's like, why didn't you become who you wanted to be? Why didn't you live according to the values that you felt were important? And if you're like me, you look at these things and you're like, gosh, that's why I wish I had more time. But I looked into it. No one's making more time scientifically. And the truth is, you really don't need more time. In truth, it sounds harsh, but it's real. You have the same 24 hours a day that Jesus had. And although your to-do list, I'm sure, is very important, I'm pretty sure nothing on it is as important as saving the world from sin. Kind of a big deal. I think often what we blame on lack of ability is more of an issue of priority. Like what we say we don't have time for is usually something we won't make time for. And we don't want to admit that to ourselves. I had a mentor one time when I was griping about my life, which I think is what mentors are for, right? I was talking to him about all the stuff I was frustrated about and how unfair my life was, and he said, listen, I want to challenge you to something. He said, eradicate I don't have time from your vocabulary, because it's a lie that's rooted in a victim mentality that says that you are not in charge of your own story. If you feel enslaved to your schedule, a schedule that you don't like, that's your choice. Own it. Instead of saying, I don't have time, say, I refuse to make time for that. It's not a high priority for me right now. Stop lying to yourself and the people around you. That was when I was like, I don't think this mentor is for me. Seems like kind of a jerk. I felt that for a while, and then I came back and I was like, you were right. Stop saying I can't when the truth is you won't. I think you ought to insist on being honest with how you talk about your own life. And here's why we don't want to do that. Because then we have to admit the choices that we've made. We have to actually admit to ourselves, it's not that I can't, I won't go to the gym. I won't slow my pace. I won't say no to a schedule that does not work for me. I won't see a therapist about this. I won't carve out time to pray and read scripture. I won't show up early to serve. It's not that I can't, I won't. And I just wonder if you started using this language to talk about the choices that you make, if you'd start making different choices. I think that's what my mentor was getting at. I don't know, I fired him. But here's the truth. You are never really trapped. You can either design your schedule or you can be dominated by it. But both are really your choice because you are radically in charge of your own story. And you might need help designing that schedule, which we hate to admit that we need help from somebody else trying to figure out how to schedule our own lives. But a lot of us do because we've never been taught how to put what's most important into our schedule and make it work for us. And we don't want to do this because if you show your schedule to someone else, they might have some annoying notes that invite you to make some changes that you don't want to make. Like, is there anything worse than the idea of somebody else knowing how you waste your own time? Scares me to death. But I got to tell you, they kind of already know. Like, the people around you, they might not know, like, what is actually on your schedule, but they can tell when you're not living your values because you're not at peace, because there's something off about you. I got to tell you, nobody in your life thinks like, hey, you seem pretty stressed and scattered and impatient and overwhelmed. What's your secret? I was hoping to feel exactly like that. These are not fruits of the Spirit, people. Some Christians act like they are, though. How many of you know Christians that act like just being miserable and angry and bitter all the time are just living God's best for them? This may be why other people do not want to know about your God. In reality, the fruit of the Spirit is not, just as a review, arrogance, annoyance, aggression, misery, anxiety, pettiness, tentativeness, griping, and blame shifting. If this is what you're channeling in the name of Jesus, he wants to let you out of the club. Jesus actually taught that of all the things that you have to do, nothing is more valuable than caring for the people around you, especially when it's inconvenient for you. And when we try and cram all this stuff into our lives, running 1,000,000 miles a minute, doing things out of order, or giving more time to things that actually aren't fulfilling or aren't on mission for our lives, this is exactly how we start to act. And so how do we do this? How do we actually make time to love God and love other people well? I'm going to give you a couple ideas. The first one is this: schedule the non-negotiables first. So to do this is kind of a trick. You have to take time to figure out what is actually most important in your life first. It's hard to schedule something that you don't know what it is. And then you frame your life around these things. And I got to tell you, have you ever said out loud what is actually most important to you, to your close friends and family? Like, are there things on your schedule that the people closest to you know are untouchable? Because it's a non-negotiable. I'll tell you, like, there's a few of them that my kids know in our house. Like, one of them is, like, if it's Sunday, we're going to church. And if we're going to church, you're there to serve somebody. So you're going to do something for someone else while we're there. It's not just there for us to consume, but for us to contribute. And they understand this. And here's the crazy thing. There have been all sorts of people that have come and stayed and lived at my house, and we don't give them a choice. If you're going to be in our house, this is what we do, right? Well, I don't believe in that. Oh, no, you don't have to believe. But you have to come, and you got to serve. Those are the requirements. That's what we do. That is a non-negotiable for us. It's a top of the stack value. The second thing is, I would suggest that you minimize mindless time suckers. And they're everywhere because we have phones. And what I mean by mindless time suckers, I'm talking about like things that you can easily get lost in, and then you look up and 2 hours have passed by, and you're like, what? No, I couldn't have been watching this show for that long, scrolling through TikTok for that long, playing this game for 3 days straight. And like, listen, these are not necessarily bad things, but they can take you away from better things, and that's the problem. All of these good things need to be put in their place. And I just wonder, what might you need to say no to so that you can say yes to your neighbors more often? It's probably some things on this list for you. And the third thing is the one nobody likes, but it's the thing I think that looks most like Jesus. Be pleasantly interruptible. And I put the word pleasantly in there because some of you are like, oh, I'm interruptible. Interrupt me and find out how. Like, hey, Stevie, what? Right? Oh, I did what they asked me. I was mad the whole time. And people are like, you know what? Ask somebody else next time. What this means is to leave margin in your schedule to be sidetracked by somebody else in need. John Ortberg, who a pastor and famous theologian writer, wrote, love and hurry are not at all compatible. Love takes time, and time is one thing hurried people don't have. And here's the thing that I have learned over the course of my life. Relationships are incredibly inefficient. And in our culture, we're obsessed with efficiency. How much can you get done as quickly and efficiently as possible to maximize profits, both personally and publicly? But in the reality, relationships, they take a lot of time. They're going to require you to trade some achievement for connection. But it's also the only thing that life is really about. I mean, that's one thing I thought as we watch people's walk into the rubble of their house. And part of the heartbreak is the fact that some of those people have invested in all of the things that burnt and none of the people that are still there. That's gut-wrenching. The Apostle John, one of Jesus' best friends and first disciples, said that there is no greater love than to lay down your life for a friend. This is a profound verse. I think it's easy to read and just think to ourselves, like, I would do that, okay? I would totally lay down my life for my friends and neighbors. I would take a bullet for them. I would die for them, and I think that's great. But will you leave work early for them? Will you change your schedule for them? Will you postpone a really important meeting for them? Because this isn't really talking necessarily about physically dying. It's talking about dying to yourself. In other words, putting what you want on the back burner to serve somebody when it's inconvenient in front of you. It's a small death. And Jesus is like, if you want to live my way, invite these small little deaths into your life every single day. And I got to tell you, if you're a parent, you should know you got a cricket following you. Okay? And they're not there to tell you what they do, although they sometimes do that. But they're watching you. And the biggest thing I think kids are watching for is they're watching how you treat other people. They're watching how you serve or judge others. They're listening when you say that you're too busy for someone, especially when the person you are too busy for is them. I got to tell you that loving your neighbors doesn't start with those next door. It starts with those under your own roof. And so here's your homework for this week. The one thing I would ask you to do, if you forget everything else, simply try this. I want you to intentionally inconvenience yourself once a day for someone you do not feel like serving. You want to know what it's like to be like Jesus? This is it right here. Praying is great. Reading your Bible, I love all that stuff. It's so good. It's so crucial. Giving, amazing. But here's the thing. Inconvenience yourself intentionally once a day for someone you don't feel like serving. You are walking in the footsteps of Jesus. This is how he lived his every single day life, and it's why people that didn't agree with him followed him. because he had time for them. Wouldn't it be great if your neighbors and your coworkers and your kids experienced you as someone who made time for those around them, regardless of what was going on with them? You know what I think of when I think of this story? Do you really think that the Good Samaritan in this story really had nothing on his to-do list? Do you really think like he had no stress in his life? You really think he had no family drama? You really think he had no anxiety issues? You really think he had nothing that he was trying to get home for because if it didn't happen, something was going to fall apart or cave in? I'm sure what makes this story most powerful is that nobody is ever just meandering around with nothing to do. He pushed pause on everything that was important to him and made them important to him. And in this way, he looked like Jesus. And when you do this, you look like your God to the people who need to see a real glimpse of him. Despite everything that the Samaritan had going on in his life, he didn't use it as an excuse to ignore his neighbors. And I just want to echo the words of Jesus and say, go and do likewise. Would you bow your heads with me this morning? God, I thank you for the lives that you have given us, for the way that you love us, for all of the needs that you take care of. And God, in this moment, in this series, but especially in this historical moment of so much devastation and destruction happening just a few miles up the road, God, I pray that you would sober us up to understand that what is most important are people. Relationships, a relationship with you and a relationship with the people that you have placed around us. God, may we be good neighbors to those in our own home and to those around our home, to those around our desk, our workspace, to those who border every piece of our life. God, may it not take an unimaginable tragedy for us to bind together with the people around us and care. May we already know them. May we already be invested in them. May we already know their stories. Because despite everything else we've got going on, the most important thing to us is loving those around us like you. May it be so. In Jesus' name, amen.